Hi everyone. I'm thinking of playing the Four Knights game Scotch variation. And so I'm looking at this book, Starting Out the Scotch Game by John Ems. And I'm going to take a look at some of the theory and a couple of the Grandmaster games that were analyzed. So the Four Knights game is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. It's called the Four Knights game for obvious reasons. And probably the most popular move here for white is bishop to b5, the Spanish four knights. But I'm going to try d4, the Scotch four knights. Now, after the usual moves, e takes d4 and knight takes d4, we could have arrived at this position through a different move order. And so I still have to decide which move order do I prefer. So another move order could have been playing the Scotch opening, which is d4 immediately here, and then black is almost obliged to take here and here. Then if black follows up with knight f6, I can play knight c3 and we get to that position. But if I play the Scotch opening way of doing it, then I have to also be prepared for the move bishop to c5, which I think is the main line Scotch, which is fine. That's a good opening as well that I can look into. But I have to make this decision because the Four Knights way of playing it also has another independent line besides the usual takes here. Black can play bishop to b4 instead, and I have to be prepared for that. And I was looking into this a little bit and decided I would probably play knight takes e5. And then there's a few moves black plays here. Queen to e7 is one, and queen to d3 is really solid. Or another one is to take on c3, and then to play queen to e7. And then I can take on c6, queen takes e4, check, queen e2, d takes c6, trade queens and push the c-pawn. And this position is about equal. So there are a lot of things to look into regarding move order. But back to this main position, however we get here, what I would expect black to play here is bishop to b4, pinning the knight. Very usual move. There are alternatives I might look at in other videos, but I just want to focus on this bishop to b4 move for now. It pins the knight, and white has a little bit of trouble here. He has to defend both e4 and d4, and you can't play queen to, or rather bishop to d3 here to defend e4 because your knight would hang. So what you have to do is first take the knight on c6, and then b takes c6, and then play bishop to d3 to defend this pawn. By the way, you probably would always face b takes c6. I don't think anybody would play d takes c6 because white can trade the queens and displace the king. But it's worth looking into a little bit. For example, if black tries to win a pawn here, I mean, you notice black is threatening the defender of the e4 pawn. I think the best continuation for white is to play bishop to d2 to unpin the knight. But then if black removes the defender and takes on e4, then white can take on g7. And then after rook g8, bishop d4, and the material is equal, but I think white is better because of the better pawn structure and the two bishops in the open position. So I'd much prefer white. So you would probably never see that recapture with the d pawn. So instead, b takes c6, and now bishop to d3. So you can see the point of playing knight takes c6 before was to remove the threat on the knight, so your knight's not hanging, and you can play bishop to d3 to defend the pawn. And now here, the most natural move, the move I would play on instinct as black, is d5. You want to push that d pawn to get your bishop out, and it seems natural to play it to d5 to strike at the center, especially with that pawn on c6 supporting it. So I see no reason not to play that. Although there are a lot of games where black plays d6, and I don't really understand that other than to control e5 perhaps and still get this bishop out. John Ems says if you play d6, you have more scope for original play. I don't know what that means. Maybe that means it's just not the main line and there's not a lot of theory, so you can create your own. But we'll look at d6 in a little while. But I would probably play d5 if I were black. And then as white, I'm going to exchange pawns here. I don't think it benefits white to play e5. Knight to g4 is a good response by black. And I actually have another video where I discuss a black repertoire against the Scotch opening, where I do recommend playing knight to g4 there, and I give some theory behind it and why it's good. So I would just exchange pawns. And by the way, black doesn't have to take back with the pawn. What if he takes back with the knight? Well, if he takes back with the knight, white can actually give up a pawn here. It's kind of hard to defend the c3 point. So white can give up a pawn for a great initiative. He can castle, and then black can capture twice on c3, seemingly gaining a tempo on the rook. But white can play bishop to a3, a very strong move, stopping black from castling. And black probably shouldn't take the rook, because then after queen takes a1, which is threatening the g7 pawn, black might have to play a move like f6. And then you can play bishop to c4 to stop this bishop from coming to e6. Beautiful move. And you've got both of these bishops just raking across the king's position. And there's a really big check coming, rook to e1. And I think white is just winning here. So that's what would happen if black took back with the knight. I don't think anybody would do that. But you just give up the pawn, just castle and give up the pawn, and play for activity. So he'll take back with the pawn, and then queen to e2 is an interesting check here. I decided I don't like it, and I'm going to play the move John Ems recommends, which is just castles. And then black can castle and bishop to g5. There's a lot of discussion about this move bishop to g5 throughout this book, throughout this chapter. And Ems says that if black has already castled, then this pinning move is more effective, because if black isn't castled and you put your bishop on g5, then black is more apt to drive it away with this combination of moves here, which if he's castled is weakening. If his king is over there on g8, then he can get into some trouble doing that. So white waits for black to castle and then plays bishop to g5. And now a good move for black is just to bolster his d pawn with c6. And that's a really good pawn duo right there. And I think it gives black equality in the position. But just to see what would happen if black doesn't play that move c6, let's look at a few alternatives. Like, what if he just ignores the d pawn and he plays something like h6 to drive our bishop away? Well, then we can play a tactic here. We can take on f6, and no matter which way black recaptures, white has a good move. If he takes with the queen, then you can play knight takes d5, of course, since that was a hanging pawn there. And black can't even recapture the pawn with queen takes b2, because rook b1 skewers the bishop, and white's going to win that bishop on the next move. So you can't really recapture with the queen and expect to remain equal in material. But what if you recapture with the g pawn? Well, you take the pawn anyway, and now you're threatening all kinds of stuff over here. And the reason you can take it anyway is because you can't take that because of a common tactic. You just released an attack on the queen there. You lose the queen. Okay, so h6 is not a good move. So that's some of the threat that's in the position here. What about bishop to e7 to relieve the pin? Well, again, you can just take on f6 and then take the d5 pawn because of the bishop takes h7 tactic. So you can't do that either. And if black takes the pawn on b2, you can play rook b1. And yes, the material is equal, but white's pieces are more active. I think John M. says white has a slight edge here. So I suppose black could try that line, but most players would play c6. Now here, queen to f3 is the move I would play as recommended, putting more pressure on the f6 point. And after queen f3, I think the most common move is bishop to e7 to protect that f6 point. Although there are some games where black plays bishop to d6 instead and just allows his pawns on f6 to get doubled. You can dismiss the move bishop g4, which might look a little tempting at first because of the tactic of removing the defender. Bishop takes the knight, removes the defender of the bishop. And so black just loses a piece there. If he tries to take your queen, you take his queen. If he takes your bishop, you take his bishop, you remain up a piece. Okay, so after queen to f3, I think bishop to e7 is the normal move. And I'll stop the theory there. That's 11 moves into this. And now we'll look at a couple games where black deviates. So let's take a look at this game where the players played the 4 knights opening move order and then the d4 move. And they played just as we described up to this point. And now, to me, I said d5 is the most natural move, but let's take a look at a game where black plays d6 instead. Okay, here, white played bishop to g5, and Ems criticizes that move and says, no, black's not castled yet. So maybe that's not the right time to pin that knight because it gives the opportunity of black playing h6 and g5. So instead he recommends delaying that move and castling and waiting for black to castle and then play it. And black doesn't have to castle. He could try other useful moves. For example, he might play knight to g4 in order to reroute his knight to the e5 square. Maybe white can drive it over there for him. But I think the point is Ems is trying to say wait on playing bishop to g5 until black's castle. Well, white plays it in this game, and then black plays h6, bishop h4, and now black plays bishop to e6 here. He can play g5, but he's waiting to see what white does with his king. For example, if white castles kingside, then black can start launching his kingside pawns and maybe even leave his king in the center of the board, if not castle queenside. And white does castle kingside, and then black plays g5. So bishop g3, h5, really committing to this kingside pawn storm here. So he's never going to be castling kingside. And now black's, the dark squared white bishop here is in danger of being trapped. White plays f4 to gain an escape square. h4 comes. The bishop goes back to e1. And then g takes f4, double-edged, opening the f file for white, but probably more significantly opening the g file for black. After rook takes f4, the move knight to d7 was an excellent move, I thought, because it opens the diagonal for the queen to come to this square, g5, and that knight can come to e5 and pressure that bishop and maybe that square. So good redeployment of the knight. White played king h1 here, maybe just a prophylactic move against bishop to c5 check or some other reason I'm not seeing. Queen to g5, bishop d2, defending the rook and putting the bishop in line with the black queen. Rook to g8, interesting idea, just leave the queen there for a minute and threaten a mate on g2. What can white do about that? Maybe he can play his rook back to f2 and threaten the queen. I'm not sure, but he tries queen to e2 to defend the point and leaves the pressure here along that diagonal. And then black plays knight to e5 and just allows a discovered attack on the queen. And white doesn't go for any discovery. He doesn't see anything worthwhile. He plays his other rook to the f file. And John M says probably a better try was to do some discovered attack and play rook takes f7. Might as well get a pawn there and attack the black queen. And then a tactical sequence could occur. For example, queen takes g2 check, queen takes g2, rook takes g2, king takes g2, bishop takes f7. And material is actually equal. So that might have been a better try for white. But instead, he doubles up the rooks on the f file. And then bishop g4 attacks white's queen. And then white makes an awful move. He just does a little self pin here. Rook 4 to f3. That does release the attack on the queen. But black can just move the queen away. And the rook on f3 just remains pinned. Which is what happened. He moves the queen to g7, bishop to e3. He can't move the rook off of f3. And now an excellent move, h3, trying to undermine this pawn on g2, which is defending the rook. So if this pawn moves forward or captures or black captures it, if that pawn's not there, then black can take the rook and white will have to recapture with a rook and black can take the other rook. And he's going to get two rooks now for two minor pieces. There's nothing white can do. He plays g3, black exchanges, gets two rooks for two minor pieces. And then black plays knight, bishop takes the knight, pawn takes back, and queen takes c3, and white had enough and resigned. And let's take a look at one more game. Let's put this one back to the beginning. Okay, so here the players played the Scotch game move order like this. And then they transposed back into this four knights variation. Then bishop b4, the standard move. White takes the knights off the board and then defends the e-pawn. So here, black didn't push the d-pawn to d6 or d5. He tried a different move. He castles. So I think he's reserving the d-pawn until he decides where he wants to put it. And still, I don't quite understand the advantage of having it on d6 rather than on d5. d5 just looks so natural to me. But anyway, white castles, rook e8, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, rook b8. So black's getting both of his rooks on the half-open files, and he still hasn't pushed his d-pawn. He could have tried pushing g5 here. Let's see what would have happened. Bishop g3. He could take the knight. Oh yeah, black could have won a pawn by this maneuver of, oops, let's go back here. By this maneuver of cutting the bishop off so that releases the knight, and then black can remove the other defender, and he could have won the pawn, but let's see what the cost is of winning this pawn. Yeah, it doesn't look so good for black because of this move queen to h5, attacking the h6 pawn. The king can come up to protect, and then f4. White's going to open the f file for his rook, and it looks like black's king is in a lot of trouble. So black probably did the right thing, not trying to win that pawn. So instead he plays rook b8. And now white plays queen to f3 here to pressure f6 some more. But John Ems points out that he likes to try f4 better. It seems more aggressive to support the e5 pawn push. And a possible line could have been bishop to c5 check, king to h1, rook takes b2. Rook takes b2 is impossible because of knight to a4, forking the pieces there, and black loses the bishop. So black can't, in other words, black can't win a pawn here by checking and then taking on b2. So John Ems does like that move f4 better, but white played queen f3. G5 was played, and now I think G5 is safer than it was in that other line because white blocked his f-pawn, and his f-pawn can't come to f4, and white doesn't get that open f-file attack. So bishop to G3. Finally, black pushes his d-pawn. And now this queen is looking like he's in a little danger because of the move bishop to G4. He has only one square. And white was panicking and thinking, okay, black is going to put his bishop on c5 to cover that square and then play bishop to g4. So he plays this weird move, knight to a4, just to control that c5 square, to keep that bishop off of that square. I think a commentator, one of the players of the game, recommended the move h3 instead as a way to prevent that attack on the queen. Just keep the bishop off of that square and don't put that knight on such an awkward square over there. But white plays knight a4, c5, c3, bishop a5, rook f e1. And that was supposedly a mistake too because of this awkwardly placed knight. Apparently white should have defended it with bishop to c2, and we'll see how that knight gets white into trouble. He plays rook f e1. Bishop g4 forces the queen over, and then bishop back to d7, attacking the knight. And now white has to play bishop to c2 to defend it. If he plays b3 to defend it, then black can exchange pieces here and then take on c3, forking the rooks. So white has to defend with the bishop, and then black can exchange and play rook takes e4, attacking the queen. So that's why that knight got white into trouble there. Okay, and in fact, black is forking these pieces, and so white has no choice. He has to take the rook and get a rook and a knight for the queen. Then f5 was played, rook e6, f4. Yeah, white's in a lot of trouble. f5 is a threat to trap that bishop. It reminds me of the Noah Ark's trap. So rook e6 traps the bishop, rook a e1, maybe threatening to pick up the queen here. But black has everything under control. He actually very smoothly plays rook takes b2, removing one of the defenders of the e8 square. And I think this is the point. Here's a long sequence. If white plays this move, then black captures, white recaptures, and then black gets out of check and attacks the rook, and he has a back rank mate threat. So white has to defend against that with a move like rook, or rather king f1, but then rook takes a2, attacks the bishop, and if the bishop moves, then white gets the rook, black gets the rook and white recovers the rook. Black finally takes that trapped bishop, and he's just up several pawns in this line. Okay, so black had everything under control when he played rook takes b2. So white plays bishop to b3, putting it in line with the king, but then black just takes the bishop and then moves his king to f7. And white resigned because his bishop is going to fall here, and the queen and bishop are far superior to the two rooks, especially with black having extra pawns. Okay, so that's my first attempt to learn how to play the Scotch game Four Knights variation, or it might be the Four Knights game Scotch variation, either way. Okay, thanks for watching the video.